over the country. I'm Steve Jester. I'm the executive director of Partnerscapes, and I'm also the gatekeeper on letting people into the meeting room. So I am going to be spending just a few more minutes checking that before we get started and letting folks in. But I do want to welcome you to the call today. We've got some great panelists and some very compelling stories that these landowners and ranchers and small business folks would like to share with you about working in conservation partnerships, sort of their perspective on a little bit of an insight as to how they have engaged and some of the challenges around engaging in conservation partnerships, and hopefully some of the opportunities and great things that they've done, because I guarantee you they've all done great things in the communities where they live and work. And just most of you should have seen from your invitation a little bit of background on these these ladies, but I'll just give a very brief introduction to all three before we get started, and then we'll take it away. But joining us from Northern California this afternoon is Dina Moore. Dina is a rancher, a small business person that runs a family owned operation with her husband and family in the northern part of California. We have Tutta Cruz from northeastern New Mexico that also ranches in one of the most lightly populated counties in the country, I believe. But Tutta does a great job of filling up that county with her personality and her heart, I tell you. And we also have Shelly Kelly from the Sandhills of Nebraska. Shelly's background is a little bit unique. She is a rancher and a landowner, but she also has experience in government service working with landowners, and now leads a landowner-led conservation group that does collaborative conservation in the Sandhills. So she has a little bit of a different perspective than either Dina or Tutta. So we're going to start off with about 20 or so minutes from each of the panelists, which will leave us about 30 minutes for questions and answers. But we're going to start off, I think, with Dina Moore from Neyland, California, to tell you a little bit about give you a little bit about her thoughts on working collaboratively with partners and partners for conservation efforts in her country and across the country. Dina.
Well, good afternoon. It's just such a pleasure to see so many familiar faces and dear friends, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you all today. I guess my thoughts about what I wanted to share with you today when we talk about landowner-led conservation is sort of, I get the opportunity, speaking first, is to look at it sort of globally. And so I used to think about landowner-led collaboration, which was trust was a large part of that. Since I have retired from the Partnerscapes, formerly PFC board, I've had the opportunity to serve locally on a community foundation board. And that community foundation board has sort of given me insights into a different approach, or has really helped me to grow sort of more in my leadership. And I guess from that perspective, I've really been juggling and struggling with how does that fit into where I've been, and how do those meld together. And I think that's a little bit of what I want to share with you today. And I think particularly for me, it's important to sort of have this conversation today when we are dealing with, on a global level, such issues of inclusiveness and equity and diversity. And so I really think that many of the lessons that we practice in our work also fit here too. So the shift in my perspective is sort of more of leadership, diversity, and community. And so that's, I think, how I want to talk about what we're doing today in this kind of work, and how that applies. And I think there's a really sweet spot there. As we get done today, I'm going to circle back to a statement by a young friend of my family's, really a good friend of my daughter's, Cody Nicholson Stratton. He and his husband run a farm called Foggy Bottoms Boys. He's a 6th generation farmer, and they're raising their son on the farm. So remind me if I forget, because I've got to close with his statement, because I think it really sums up where we all are. So I want to share a couple stories with you that sort of gives you that introduces what I want to think about or talk about. Early on in my work, 20 plus years ago, working on community conservation and collaboration, I had the incredibly unique opportunity to be introduced to a fellow from the Environmental Protection Agency. All my friends from PFC will tell you how I can react about EPA. But this fellow, Chris Heppy, was absolutely remarkable. He understood stakeholder involvement. Within our watershed, we were being listed as sediment impaired by the Environmental Protection Agency because of the impacts that it was having on migrating salmon and coho. And so, you know, we as landowners were incredibly threatened by EPA involvement, by EPA being here, by the regulatory sort of program that was coming our way. So Chris reached out to me. From his reaching out to me, we formed a landowner group that represented 80,000 acres in the mid-domain of our watershed. And we worked side by side with Chris during the development of the technical TMDL. But really, most importantly, what I got from that, what my community got from that, what we all got from that was trust, communication, and connectedness. We started a movement and with momentum that has lasted more than 20 years. And I don't think it would have been possible if it were not for the leadership inspired by this incredible man who took a lot of risks on his own. So I'm going to segue to my second story, and this occurred about 3 years ago. So we as a landowner group are still functioning. We are pretty high functioning. We now have a new problem, and it's elk in our watershed. And the elk is a conflict with our cattle grazing. We've had huge impacts. Folks have had to lower the number of cattle they're carrying, all of that sort of stuff. So it's gotten to be a significant management issue on multiple levels for landowners, and the landowners are pretty, it's reactive, like many things, exactly like the TMDL and the EPA was. We went to Sacramento. We met with some leaders with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. There was one sort of lower level manager who was purposefully antagonistic to every single one of my landowners there. And that conversation digressed. And what really happened was it created barriers. It slowed down the momentum for years, and it negatively impacted our relationship working with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And so I think really what I wanted, the purpose of my sharing those two stories with you are just sort of where we can all be with regards to our relationship and our connecting with each other, and the importance and values of connection and trust. So as I thought about that, and again, I reflected about where I'm growing and how we're all growing, really there came to my mind sort of three different issues I think to address. And that is, as I said earlier, leadership, diversity, and community. So leadership is a practice. Leadership is a verb. Leadership is about helping communities, organizations, or individuals or businesses face up to their most difficult and pressing issues. It's about making progress on really tough issues. As I was sort of getting ready for my talk, I was looking at some books that I have on leadership, and one of them is a book called Credibility by Kouzes and Posner. And what they say are leaders are adventurers and pioneers. And that so felt like it applied to all of us on the call today. Leadership leads to trust and collaboration. I think what's really interesting to me is anyone can be a leader. So as we're talking about it, leadership spans, you know, sort of all sectors, I guess. Leadership does not have to do with authority, power, and influence. That should not define leadership. Instead, leadership is about building synergy, social capital, and stakeholder trust. As you guys know, and I think as Partnerscapes know, and I know that my friend Paula Golightly knows, hi Paula, relationships are primary. You know, everything else is secondary. And I know that all the good work that I've been able to do, it really has been building those relationships with friends that has inspired the trust. It's enabled us to grow beyond where we ever thought we could go. Leaders are able to sort of set aside their own agendas, their judgment, and their internal dialogue. They listen with an open heart and mind. Truly listening is a sign of deep respect for each other. And I think really what it is it's being responsible, taking ownership of problems and breakdowns, and being proactive, not reactive. So that's sort of going to be, that's my spiel for you all on leadership. Diversity. I think, again, given where we all are right now, we need to pause and take a deep and thoughtful breath about diversity. Organizations can no longer afford to be homogeneous. Diversity is an asset that helps us to be creative and innovative. It means establishing a sense of belonging for everybody. It means having the ability to walk in another's shoes. It means having empathy for where somebody else is, where they have been, and where they're going. It's about diverse stakeholders. It's about truly engaging at a core level with people who are different from us. It supports inclusiveness, it adds value, and it creates opportunity, in my mind, for radical or conservative, but radical breakthroughs. Competing values and interests are there, are important, and are legitimate. I think differences of opinion are powerful, and to be able to work through them really creates synergy. Leaders have the ability to manage people's passionate differences in a way that diminishes destructive potential, but rather constructively harnesses the energy. It creates the opportunity to build unexpected alliances. And so then finally, community. And I want to share a little bit about community with you all today. Communities share connections and a collective intention. Communities recognize that the sum is greater than its part. There are commitments to shared vision, having an appreciation for the value of working collaboratively and cooperatively, willing to make other people's problems your own. But I think it's really important to remember and reflect that communities will dissipate if neglected. They need nourishment and dedication from its members through traditions, behaviors and sharing of knowledge. So in my community, in the PFC community, those sharing that building of relationships has always been sort of over a beer and barbecue or at the kitchen table. So I'm going to circle back to this incredible statement by my friend Cody Nicholson Stratton that talks about the kitchen table. I got to read it because I can't do it justice by itself. So he states that, what if we acknowledged that climate change was real? What if we accepted that grazing, logging, and burning done right all provide ecological services? What if we brought forest, rangeland, and fire ecologists along with the environmental and climate scientists to the table? What if at the table sat farmers, ranchers, native voices, and environmental leaders? What if we set aside all the rhetoric and work together for healthier ecosystem, food systems, and communities? What if? So that's sort of my thoughts that I wanted to share with you today. I think that's it, unless you guys have questions for me, or Steve, have I missed something really obvious? Or anyway, again, just such a pleasure to see so many of you from my my friends.
Well,
Thanks. I got to So how did we get our major stakeholders to the table? What made EPA join, and how long did it last? So really, I think what brought stakeholders to the table, to be really honest with you guys, was fear. There was the fear of regulation. And I think that fear in and of itself can actually be a really healthy motivator, getting us outside of our comfort zone. But that's really what brought us to the table. But what kept us at the table and kept us going was really, truly an individual from the EPA who was willing to take a risk, who was willing to honestly at times get pretty bruised and beat up by our landowners who saw him as the Environmental Protection Agency rather than as an individual performing a job. And I so admired his tenacity and his ability to come back to us again and again and again. But what he did is he supported us. And so we, through that relationship with him, built on trust over a period of time, were able to allow people to come into our landscapes, to conduct assessments. And at the end of the day, what the assessments showed was that our grazing was not impacting the watershed or water quality. And that for our landowners was huge. So I think, Jim, I hope that answers the question, but it allowed the stakeholders to come to the table. Versus, I guess what I would say to you guys is the experience we had at the office with, our state wildlife folks, where there was clearly nobody was willing to put aside their egos, I guess, or engage in those really robust, hard conversations that were working on solutions with winning outcomes for everybody there. It's not win-lose anymore, it's win-win. And how do we create that opportunity for win-win in a broader sense, I want to say, than we have before. All righty, it?
We had one more question, Dina, from John in West Virginia about whether or not has there been a breakthrough on the elk issue with California Fish and Game, and if so, well, if there has, what was the breakthrough, or how do you? I guess do you see a path forward yet? Have you even identified a path forward yet?
John, I got to tell you, I've stepped out of it for a couple reasons. It's a huge issue, and I've stepped out of it because I've had other things that I'm doing with this community foundation that's sort of meeting my needs in a different way. Kind of felt like banging our heads against a wall. There has been some small movement forward, but politically, as you guys know too, hunting isn't particularly popular in all sectors. And in a state like California, it's particularly unpopular with a large part of the population. And to be very honest, I think that we have leadership that is unable right now to sort of make a change. So no, our elk population is growing and growing, and again, you know, not unique to my part of California, nor is it unique to California, but no good resolutions yet. And what's sad to me is I think there were some really cool people who were working on it at a lower level, but they weren't able to get any traction. And basically our landowners absolutely shut them down. So different than EPA when they open the doors.
Well, that's certainly the people involved are key, and that was a message throughout, and the relationships with those people. Let's jump over and hear from Tutta from New Mexico and get her perspective. And if you have questions that come to mind, just keep typing them in chat. And if we don't get to them right after the panelists speak, we'll get to them at the end. Go ahead, Tutta.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Dina. I am in agreement with you on every level. That was outstanding. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for sharing those words of wisdom to everyone. My perspective is coming from a landowner stewarding working lands. And we live in the northeastern corner of the state, very remote, but beautiful landscape. Ute Creek Cattle Company's mission is to sustain people, profit, water, wildlife, conservation, cattle, and community. We operate our ranch under a pretty big umbrella, and we manage the land for wildlife and bird habitat development, and we implement a rest and time-managed grazing system, and using cattle as a tool, we try to maximize soil health and forage production. And the cattle also provide a stream of income for the business. So we look at it a little, I think, fresh, a little fresh perspective on that. I personally believe that everything is connected to the land. People, water, food, shelter, habitat, wildlife, our workplaces, everything is connected to the land. And I don't think people often give that fact enough thought, because we are it, and we are together always, symbiotically. I also think that people need to remember that 71% of the land is privately owned. And so these private landowners have a big responsibility of caring for wildlife habitat, caring for water, clean air, making a living on the land, raising food. We make big decisions, and it's a huge responsibility on every level. A few years ago, we had a workshop here at the ranch. It was called Discovering New Ranch Dollars Through Nature. And we brought the folks in from Canadian Texas, just a great group of people. And they had completely turned their economy around through nature tourism. And so we brought Ramel Farr and Bob Rogers in to keynote this talk. And Ramel is one of those honey-toned Texas women that's so charming. And she has this good-looking cowboy in the front row. We had 72 people that came to this, and this is a long way to come for anything. But we had a nice crowd, and Ramel looked at this guy and said, "Tell me, how much of the land is in the urban area, or how many people live in the urban areas?" And he said, "Well, about 98%. And so she said, "Well, how many people live on the land?" He said, "Well, about 2%. So she turned to the audience and she said, "Well, how do you think the vote's going to go?" You know, that was an epiphany for me. That impacted me like a bop on the head. And I thought about this, and I thought, you know, not only do I have to take care of the land on Ute Creek Cattle Company, we're very conservation oriented, but I had to be accountable to 98% of the people in the urban areas. That I needed to tell them my story of how hard we worked to take care of healthy land, to take care of wildlife, clean air, water, and raise healthy beef for our consumers. We take that very, very seriously. And I wanted at that time to feel that I could tell them my story honestly and completely. and make them realize and appreciate, acknowledge what we're doing on the land, so that they would have a more, it would change their attitudes toward landowners and how hard we work to try and do the right thing on the land for everybody, because we're all connected to it. We take healthy soil very seriously, and 71% of landowners in this country, if they did the same thing, we could sequester a lot of carbon out of the air and make a big impact on it. So we need to be thinking seriously about that. In New Mexico, it's an arid state, very drought prone. We have a saying here called agua es vida, water is life. And so we try to conserve water at every opportunity. We've done some kind of edgy things. We use shade balls on our 20-foot stock tanks. We have reduced evaporation on one tank by 91% annually and saved annually 16,000 gallons of underground water. Just on that one little tweak that we've done. We have 9 tanks covered now, and we'll do more. We xeriscape our yards. We have roof water catchments on the roofs, and we're working on our playa lakes. We have a few playa lakes here, and they function as taking water into the underground formation so that we can store surface water there. About 20 years ago, I inherited 1/5 of my family's ranch. And when we came back here to live, we were very geared toward conservation. We knew what we had to do, we knew what we wanted to do. And so we began with the restoration on Ute Creek. We have 10 miles of Ute Creek running through the ranch diagonally, and it was completely infested with salt cedar. So the first collaborative conservation effort that we became involved with was a very, very big project, because that was fairly new at the time. And these salt cedar plants are high water using plants. They can drink up to 20 to 30 or 200 to 300 gallons of water a day. And our trees were very large and mature and very, very severe infestation. So we worked with the Ute Creek Soil and Water Conservation, the NRCS, the New Mexico Water Trust Board, the National Wild Turkey Federation, the Department of Game and Fish, the Canadian River Riparian Restoration Project, and there were a couple of others in there. I'm not able to name them all, but together we came up with a plan, and we implemented it. And within a year, we saw water. The water table was elevated, and we had within 2 years we had water running down the creek year round. It was a very successful collaborative effort. And not only did we have a successful outcome, but we built relationships and friendships and trust. And to this day, we have that wonderful sense of accomplishment, and those relationships are intact, and it's very, very rewarding. The other thing that we've done that I think is probably one of the most successful projects was putting in an adaptive rest and time managed grazing plan. And for that, we worked with the holistic management folks and worked a lot with Kurt Gazia, who's a consultant, a terrific guy, very knowledgeable. And we worked very closely with the NRCS. And when I inherited the ranch, we had 4 large pastures, and we took it early on to 23 pastures with permanent fencing in it. And along with that was a water distribution system, because you have to have water to every pasture, and that was a major undertaking as well. And then one of the most delightful projects that I've been involved with, I celebrated another milepost birthday back then, and my daughter said, "Mother, let me take care of a group gift." And so she did. And I got $2,500 from my friends for a birthday gift to start a wild bird sanctuary. I didn't know I had that many friends, and it was so much fun and so exciting, but I knew I didn't want to do it alone. So we went to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Partners in New Mexico and worked with some phenomenal people. We have a drip system, we have a well designated to that, we have a little grape arbor, we have a mowed walking path and some contemplative areas. And it's truly a beautiful 23-acre spot. set aside for short-breast prairie birds, which are in decline, by the way. And interestingly, the wild bird sanctuary has been one of the most unique and rewarding things that we've done on the ranch with all of our conservation efforts. So it's been terrific, and I'm really, really proud of it. New Mexico has a lot of progressive ranchers. I mean, we have neighbors all around us doing some incredible work. And I just read the Fly Lake Joint Venture newsletter a few days ago. And in Clovis, New Mexico, I was so impressed with what they're doing. The private Lake Joint Ventures has partnered up with the New Mexico U.S. Fish and Wildlife Partners, and they're collaborating with the landowners in the Melanson area where they have the lesser prairie chicken, and they're doing prescribed burning now, and that's enhancing the habitat for the lesser prairie chicken. It's really nice to see the landowners working together with the Fish and Wildlife folks. The city of Clovis is collaborating with the Playa Lake Joint Venture to increase underground recharge from surface water. And it's really unusual. And they're also working with the Soil and Water Conservation District. But together they're making a difference because Clovis's water is very precious, and they're having to really be careful what the crops they grow and how they use it. The other thing that's working together are the conservation easements in that area, because they're trying to protect the land from development so that the lesser prairie chicken can thrive. And so the Land Conservancy and the NRCS and Fly Lake Joint Venture and ConocoPhillips have come together to help with putting together some conservation easements. And then the other thing that I see happening is the oil and gas people are really stepping up reclamation efforts. And I think that's a very positive move on their part. So I'm really proud of that. We deal with a lot of challenges here in New Mexico because we're arid and very drought prone. And I would say that in the last 20 years that we've been home, the greatest challenge that we have dealt with is climate change. And I think it's also the most critical challenge that we face. Because we have continuous drought, the temperatures are hotter, the winds are more consistent and higher in speed. We've had no winter moisture for the last probably 6 years, not one snowflake last year. We didn't have any rain until the end of July, and we finally had some until the end of June, and in July we had some rain. We grew a little grass. This lack of moisture impacts our soil health, and it impacts wildlife habitat across the ranch. It also affects our bottom line because our calves, we sold them early and they were lighter than they've ever been. But because of the winter coming on, we had no choice but to do that. So the critical element of climate change must be addressed. And I encourage, all landowners and all citizens to be realistic about this and take every precaution, take every resource possible to conserve your water. The other thing that we've noticed is we have an increase in the invasive plants that require a more dry climate, like cactus and mesquite, and we're having to deal with heavy growth of that. And even on some of the areas that have been cleared, we're getting regrowth because they like hot, dry places to grow in. So that's a problem for us. I think a problem across the board for all private landowners and for all people involved in agriculture is development. There are millions of acres of habitat lost every year to development. And this is irreversible. You can't reclaim a housing development. You can reclaim mineral development and get the land put back into functioning and healthy condition, but you can't do that with homes. And so I think we all need to take a very, very long look at what we see happening around. And I think that's where I can bring in the topic of leadership, because I see leadership in all the landowners that I personally know. And I know it's there. There are a few things that I'd like to see happen. I like what Dina said about leaders. Anyone can be a leader. And there are many people who are, but don't realize it. But I think that it's really important for the role of the landowner to step up a notch or two. And I would suggest that maybe landowners need to have a mirror image. Well, we all have a mirror image. We have to be able to see ourselves as others see us. And that's referred to as a mirror image. And I think we really need to look at what we're doing and ask ourselves the question, how are we managing our resources? And are we doing the best that we can do? So that's very important to be able to do. I think being a good observer on your own family operations is very important. And you have to ask yourself, is your business sustainable? You know, have you done everything you can to keep your business together when you pass away? Getting in touch with your mortality is not easy, but you know, it's really part of owning a business and having a family and having privately owned land that you'd like to hold on to for future generations. So you need to think about these things. You need a succession plan, and you need to be able to discuss what you want with your children, because if you don't have this put together before you pass away, you run the risk of your children selling the ranch to developers. And that may not be what anyone wants to do, but that could be an outcome of something you didn't plan on or didn't want. And I like to ask people, you know, what are you leaving when you pass away? What are you leaving? You really, all anybody leaves is the memory that they have left in the hearts and minds of those people whose lives they've touched. That's really all anyone leaves. But when you have an asset like privately owned land, you know, that's a very precious resource. To me, land is sacred. Our family's been on this land for 200 years, and I feel such a sense of responsibility and a love for the land that I want my adult children, Libby and Ted, and my grandchildren, Bella and Bennett and Seth, to keep this land in the family. And so we've done everything we can. You have to continually update your plan too, but we've communicated well. I even had to get a younger attorney because suddenly the attorney that I'd used for 15 years was as old as I was. So I got one that's younger than my adult kids so that he can carry them through and maybe work with the grandkids a little bit. These are things that I think are a demonstration of leadership, and they begin with your family, and they begin with all private landowners across the board and business owners. So the other thing that I believe is really, really important, and I learned this with Partnerscapes and through all the wonderful people that I've been associated with on that board. I think it's critically important that landowners tell their story, and especially tell the story to people who are not connected to the land. Even though we're all connected to the land, they're not connected in the way that we are because we're providing food, they need to understand what we do, and we are the ones to tell the story. And the easiest way to do it is through social media. And sometimes with ranchers, it's kind of hard to get into this new way of communicating. I see so many Zoomers now, it's really fun, and Facebook and what is it called? Twitter and Tweet and Snapchat and all these other fun mediums that we can grow up to be big boys and girls and use and communicate with our kids, particularly our grandkids. Just let them do it. Tell them what message you want to put and give them the job, and they'll do a beautiful job. And one thing I want to make very clear, Alan Savory, this incredible man who's left such a legacy in his lifetime and continues to. I heard him on 3 different speaking events. He said, and I quote, "Women must be involved or nothing will happen." So I want you to remember, if you want something done, ask a busy woman to do it. And she'll do a fine job, she'll get it done, and you'll be very, very grateful to have her on board. So the other thing that I think is so important, and we really cannot, as landowners, as rural community members, we can't let this go. When you're looking into your own business and your own situation, take a look at your community. when I'm traveling, I frequently, if I have to stop anywhere, I drive down the main street because I want to see if there's life on the main street, if the buildings are shuttered, and or if there's people downtown shopping. And I like to know what's going on. You can tell instantly the economic health of any rural town that you stop in. And it's really very satisfying to see revitalization occurring and to see life on the main street. But if you want to have this big umbrella that we all operate under, you know, if you want your children to come home, you have to have a community that they want to come to. I look at it as I want to be able to have my grandkids get a latte or a beer at a microbrewery or a great hamburger somewhere. And I wouldn't mind having an art shop or something that they can just enjoy. We have phenomenal outdoor recreation here in our county, but these other amenities are lacking. When I was a little girl, we'd go to the movie at the Mesa Theater. The building's still there and it's intact. And we're working on restoring the Mesa Theater. That's one of our Main Street goals. You ought to be able to go to a movie, you know? I just think these kids need to be made aware that they're wanted at home, and families have to talk to them and communicate them about their future and invite them to come home. Because if you don't have young families there of reproductive age, you can't keep the schools open. There's just, your community will just evaporate and go away. You don't have to let that happen. There's too many programs and opportunities available in this day and age that can help you mitigate that issue. And I'll tell a little story. I think the agriculture community's greatest asset is their youth. I mean, we've got ranch kids here that are so incredible. They're smart. They can think. They can make anything. They can put anything back together. They're trustworthy. They have integrity. They're polite. They're just top drawer kind of kids. And we started this program 4 or 5 years ago, our Main Street community here. And every year at graduation, we buy a mailbox for each of the graduates. I get a little emotional when I tell this story because it's so important to me. But we give them this message. We say, congratulations on your graduation. And we want you to go to college or to a vocational program and work for a while away from home. But when you get ready to settle down, we want you to come back home to Hardee County and live and raise your children here. And we got a mailbox here with your name on it, and we have a place for you. And we'll help you start your business, and we'll help you with the life that you want to share with your children, which was much like the life that you knew it as you were growing up. You know, it's the best place in the world to raise children. And so I'm going to conclude with that thought. And I just hope that I've shared some ideas of things that might work and shared what we do here at Ukri Cattle Company. I think I'm the most fortunate person in the entire world to live where I live and get to do what I do with those that I love around me. So thank you. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Tata. Very, very, very good job. I did have one question from Jim from Montana before you go, specifically about the recent soil health initiative in New Mexico and how you guys were able to get the legislature involved, and where is some of the funding coming from to help implement that?
Sure. You know, there was a group in New Mexico that started the soil health movement because they were convinced that regenerative agriculture is the key to healthy soil and to educating people about it, to providing this information to them. And it does require funding. The whole program did. So they went to several of the legislators, and this organization wrote the bill and then presented it to several of the legislators. One was Jack Chatfield, who's our representative from Harding County. And they had a number of ranchers that went and testified before the legislature, and it was passed and it was funded. I think it was something like 150,000 the first year, and it's more this next year, but it's been very, very successful. And the whole program is directed under New Mexico State University. And it's been very, very broad spread, and people are involved with it. They're learning from it. We had they called it the Healthy Soil Roadshow. Last year they had a workshop in Las Cruces, one in right out of Albuquerque, and then one at Mosquero. And we had over 100 people who went here in Hardin County. They were well attended in every location. And then they had a grant program. You could apply for a grant, and they're really making headway on creating healthy soil in New Mexico. And I'm just very proud of what they've done, proud to have been a part of it.
Well, and as I recall, it was primarily landowners leading the way
Yes,
on that as well.
Yeah, these busy women at the CS ranch is who it was. The Davis family, Julia and Kim and Linda Davis. You don't find busier women and more competent women anywhere in the world than those three. So.
There you go. Well, let's jump over to Nebraska and hear from Shelly. We'll try to get her in before nap time for her little ones over with. So go ahead, Shelly.
Thanks. Yeah, he's still snoozing away, thankfully. I'm recovering a little bit from a cough, so if I have to take a break and a drink, I'll have to do that. But I'm so honored to get to be a part of this conversation with these two stellar women. It almost makes me a little bit nervous, truthfully, to share my story, because there's just so many wonderful stories out there. And the good thing about sharing ours is Nebraska's culture for community conservation is top notch, and it's really great. But I do have, in Steve's introduction, I do have a little bit of a different background and some variety of experiences that has made me be able to bring people together from a couple different sides of the conservation story. I grew up on a ranch, on a farm. I've been involved with ranching my whole life in some capacity or another. And not only did I grow up on a ranch, but my folks were pretty suspicious of anybody willing to give money for something on their private property. And so we were suspicious of the government. We were suspicious of conservation organizations. And when I went off to college, well, even a little bit before, the NRCS offered me a position. And when I talked with my dad about it and showed him what they were willing to pay for a salary, which just kind of blew our minds a little bit, he's like, well, maybe it'd be okay to go see what they're all about. And you can share, the information that you have through plant identification and grazing, and maybe it won't be all bad. Well, I built a career with NRCS. I worked with them all through college, and then worked for them full time for 5 years after that as a range management specialist. While I was working, I was ranching with my ex-husband on their large sixth generation family ranch. And I helped many ranchers with conservation projects to better their property with regards to resources. And it really helped me build the dialogue in my mind and in others' minds that this money, taxpayer money, could be used to benefit our natural resources across the landscape by encouraging landowners to adopt innovative practices that they wouldn't have been able to likely on their own. And so it speeds up the process of adoption for conservation. And it undeniably works. The only limitation that I saw was the limitation that I witnessed growing up, and that was the lack of trust and the lack of credibility. And we do still fight that a little bit today, but boy, we're moving in the right direction. And so after my time with the NRCS, I was blessed enough to get hired by the Sandhills Task Force as their executive director. And that's been 6.5 years ago. And through that, it's given me the ability to build partnerships like I've never had the ability to do before. And we partner with so many organizations right now, and it is benefiting ranchers in the Sandhills dramatically, as well as educating the public, that 98% that Tutta talked about. We have to keep educating and telling our story. And we're in the process right now of hiring more individuals for our team so that we can do a better job of telling our story. Instead of just doing the work, we have to tell the story of the work that we're doing too. Because even though the people around us get to see what we're doing and it's so obvious, it's the people in Lincoln and Omaha that really need to know, as well as in Washington, D.C., that need to know what we're doing out here and how good it's working. And so I started with the Sandhills Task Force. My background really gave me the credibility to understand ranchers and communicate with them. And then also having spent 10 years with the NRCS, I could understand the plight of the federal government worker. There's a lot of restrictions and a lot of hoops and a lot of things that they have to work through. But the other thing is there's not a whole lot of people like me working in the conservation field or the wildlife biology field. More and more, we're getting more and more distance between production agriculture and the general public. And so while there used to be a lot of folks that worked in your fellow NRCS or Fish and Wildlife Partners Program positions, a lot of them came from farms and ranches. That's not so much the case anymore. And the people that are making policies and developing programs for landowners, in our case, ranchers, a lot of times they don't have that hands-on experience and they haven't been in the trenches of ranching and trying to figure out how we're going to put food on the table in years of drought. And so it's so important to get landowners at the table far before you have all of the details put together. I've heard it too many times that when I ask, why are there not more ranchers around this table as we're discussing this new grant that we're going to write, or we're doing talking about new policy or how we're going to implement something new. I hear people say, we want to get the details right so we don't, so we have a better story. We can tell our story better when the ranchers show up. Well, that's not the way to handle it. You really need to get the ranchers in the room when you're working through all of the minutia, because they can, not only can they help save time, but they can increase your amount of trust and credibility you're going to have with their peers. And so there's nobody that can develop a plan to help resources better than the people that have been managing them for generations. And the most well-meaning people that feel like they can develop a program the best probably are going to have some oversight on an issue or two, because they just haven't been around all the time. And those ranchers sitting in the room, as you're talking about how we're going to do all of this, they'll pipe up and say, hey, if you have this part of it, you're not going to be able to accomplish this because X, Y, Z. If you have your sign up period in the 1st of April, you're not going to have anybody sign up because everybody's out cabbing and they're lucky to remember if they ate breakfast or not. And so those types of things are really important. And my rallying cry a little bit, we have a diversity of people on this talk, both agency folks and conservation organization folks, as well as landowners, is to get landowners at the table just as soon as you can. And I've had a lot of questions about, you know, how do you get landowners to show up? They're just so busy. I don't think they're going to be interested. Well, you know, if you go up to them and say, hey, I want to do this on your land or in your county or in your district, what do you think? They're going to be, you know, you've already kind of lost them. But if you say, hey, we have this issue. I've noticed that we have this issue. I'd like to talk to you more about it. And I'm determined to raise money and find resources so that we can address it. Then all of a sudden they're engaged. And so the type of communication that you use when you're talking to landowners is really important, and let them help solve the problem. Don't just, and they might even tell you problems you didn't know were there. If you start brainstorming with folks and you go in talking about prairie chickens, all of a sudden you might learn that the curlews have left and they haven't been back for the last 10 years. And ranchers are really concerned. And so as you start looking at that, the two probably are interconnected, but there's been so much tracking on prairie chickens and nobody's really been tracking the curlews, but the ranchers out there notice those kinds of things. And so that's a really important thing to do, is to try to ask the questions and get them involved in the brainstorming. And let them know that you're on their side. We're talking about working lands, collaborative conservation. And the very key part of that is the working lands. And it only gets to be working lands if people can make their living at it. And so they have to be able to maintain a profit. They can't donate all of their funds or all of their time or all of their income to any cause, because then it no longer becomes reasonable for them to maintain ownership of the property. And if we start losing the ability of folks to be able to make their living on the landscape, boy, we're going to be in a world of hurt, because all of a sudden we're going to have to bring in new industries that bring about a whole array of new concerns that we haven't even began to address. In Nebraska, we're luckily, very thankfully, we don't have a lot of invasive species. We do have some, but a lot of them aren't noxious. There are natural ones that we've brought upon ourselves because we quit burning our landscape. But if we start bringing in exotic species to try to bring in more tourism to Nebraska, or more fee hunting or something like that, I guarantee you we're going to have bigger and worse problems that we're not going to be able to address with near the amount of financial resources that we have today. And so we need to work with ranchers and other landowners. So this is a nationwide deal. The foresters, we need to work with people that are managing timber, that are managing desert areas, that are managing prairies. We need to work with everybody and learn what they're trying to do. If you want to do conservation on their landscape, boy, you really need to get to know their industry. Another thing about credibility or a tree farm, go attend their industry meetings. Go get out there and figure out how you can learn more about their industry, whether it's just asking a million questions or trying to attend some of their trainings that they go to. It's really important. And then the diversity, diversity side of things, both ladies did a great job talking about diversity, but one thing about diversity that maybe wasn't brought up is the diversity of people with experience, the beginning ranchers as well as the experienced ranchers, getting them to have conversations together. They just kind of look at things a little bit differently, and different is most definitely a benefit when it comes to trying to talk about conservation and tackle these problems. Taking the holistic approach is so important, and the more ways you can try to challenge yourself to look at any particular problem is going to help you. Market's closed, in case you're wondering. But so that. And then the last topic that I was going to talk about a little bit was the Sandhills Task Force. The Sandhills Task Force is a nonprofit rancher-led organization that was started 27 years ago. I was not involved in the formation of it, but I have studied the formation of it quite intensively because I think it's one of the most successful organizations out there with regard to the amount of funding that we've been able to receive and the amount of positive impact we've been able to have on the landscape. And really it started kind of due to the fear that Dina talked about. There was mistrust between the government and ranchers. And instead of just hunkering down in their individual corners, they decided to have a conversation. And so individuals with Nebraska cattlemen sat down with individuals with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and had a frank conversation. They had a respectful conversation, but they shared all of their concerns and talked them all out. A lot of the concerns were dispelled. Some of them were in fact true, but people changed their stance a little bit once they realized how the other party felt. In the end, they realized they were really working towards the same thing. And so they sat down, decided to form a group and formalize this conversation so that as new programs were developed, it went through this process of talking with ranchers. And the Sandhills Task Force is comprised of a 16-member board, at least 9 of them have to make their primary livelihood from ranching in the Sandhills or be retired from ranching. And so that supermajority of ranchers on that board ensures that there's no government organization going to come in and try to railroad anything. There's great conversations held. And nearly every board meeting, we meet quarterly, there's usually some pretty intense conversations on one topic or another, but they're necessary conversations that we need to have. We don't always agree with everybody, but we can at least learn something from the other party, and it does make a difference as on how we communicate it with our peers. And so our peers can either be the landowners taking the information back to their neighbors, or the conservation organization folks taking information back to their peers too. But so decided to join forces, and we've been applying conservation to the landscape at rapidly increasing rates. The organization started with no paid employees, and the board members just volunteered their time. They hired a part-time employee, and when they hired me, I was full-time plus, they said, and they weren't wrong. And I did hire some help here, would have been 3 years ago, and we're in the process of expanding again, and we're going to roll out a whole new program later on this year, not just working at applying conservation practices to the landscape, but on holistic ranch management, holistic ranch planning, so that we can keep ranchers ranching. We are really concerned that people are going out of business at alarming rates. And we want to do our best to help ranchers with their plans financially, with their drought plans, with their written grazing plans. And so we're gonna see how that happens. It's gonna be some workshops and one-on-one work. But my big point when I heard about this topic was I really wanted to speak on the power of getting landowners involved, and it's so powerful. And I don't care if you're in a group in an area where you're not getting much landowner feedback, take the effort to go bang on some doors and sit at some kitchen tables or lean over a hood with somebody and really talk to them about it, and they'll share, and you'll get a lot of good information. So anybody that is struggling with it, I'm sure happy to talk with folks about it. And thanks so much, Steve, for rounding us all up and getting us here and getting this crew put together, and everybody for taking their time to be on. This type of connection is different than the types of connection that we're used to. But I think this connection is so important as we're working through new and different times, and our partnerships have suffered a little bit. How could you not suffer on partnership levels when you can't see people face to face near as much? But I just want to appreciate the folks on taking their time to be here and continuing to reach out to one another and continuing to learn.
Thanks, Shelly. Great stuff. I do have a couple of questions from the chat that I'll throw out there to get us started. We'll have time for several questions. We'll stay here till the bottom of the hour if folks still have questions. But the first one I have is from Cynthia. And Cynthia, I tried to unmute you, but couldn't do it on my end. If you're able to unmute yourself, you can. But I will go ahead and ask your question. Oh, there you are. Go ahead, Cynthia.
Hey, Steve, thank you. And thanks to all the presenters. What great stories, very compelling. I think it's wonderful that you mentioned the importance of storytelling. It is key and critical. And I think that I understand your message based on these great stories. My question for you, thinking about communications and thinking about wanting to affect an outcome, my question is, what is the outcome that you would want to affect with these stories? So what are you trying to get people to understand or to do? And that could go to anybody, any of the three speakers.
This is Tada. I'll jump in here for just a moment, and then Dina, you can come. My goal was to inform people who are not on the land of what actually happens on the land, because there seems to be a disconnect. People have a lot of opinions about the environment and wildlife and all of these things, but they have no understanding or appreciation of the fact that private landowners provide this habitat for the wildlife, and they do it because it's what they do. It's because they're connected to the land. There's no incentive to do it. There's no payment. It's just there, and we take care of them. And for me, I wanted someone to say thank you. Thank you, Tada, for being so aware of wildlife and healthy food. Thank you for what you do on the land. That's really all I was anticipating. And I have to tell you, Cynthia, I've been thanked several times now, and it really means a lot to me. So something as simple as that, to be aware, to acknowledge, and to appreciate what others are doing on your behalf.
Thank you.
And I think, Cynthia, to follow up with what Tada said, Shelly really nailed it. When she spoke of sort of well-meaning and oversight. I live in a rural community like many folks here, and I think that so often our rural communities are dependent upon our natural resource use and extraction. And I think we have a tremendous responsibility towards stewardship. And that's one of the things I love about our partners, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Partners Program. And one of the things I love about Partnerscapes is that we have a core shared belief and understanding of the values of that. But as I expand into my larger community, I think it's my responsibility to sort of bridge gaps. And as I grow in my understanding of the needs of my rural community, what I'm really trying to do is provide an opportunity or a segue for cross communication about how perhaps what I'm providing is of value and benefit to my rural community that well-meaning, well-intentioned folks don't understand. At the same time, as I'm learning and growing, I think it's really incumbent upon me to bring back to my agricultural community the larger world challenges that we're all dealing with as well. And I think that there's a sweet spot there that we need to find. But to me, it's really about being able to bridge critical gaps, because I think that we on the landscape have the ability and the responsibility to address climate change, those sorts of things. But in California, we can't legislate climate change. And we really need to be able to look at holistic practices that help me to be able to do a better job as resource manager. So anyway, I could go on, but I hope that answers it in part for you, but that's sort of my perspective of it.
And then I'll follow up with a real specific example. Like in our area, it was being pushed by some organizations that if you were going to do a prescribed burn on your property for cedar control, eastern red cedar control, you had to defer grazing for an entire year. Well, if you defer grazing for an entire year, there goes your income for all of those acres. And even though it is an investment in getting rid of those cedar trees, it was a practice that was preventing a lot of individuals from adopting it. And so working together with landowners and groups, we devised a plan where if you had rotational grazing in place, you could graze it early the year before, and then you could burn it. And that year that you burned it, you can still graze it as long as you got adequate moisture. And all of a sudden, people were excited about it. And it's not just because of that slight policy tweak, but it was also because landowners were involved in that conversation. And landowners went back and they talked to their neighbors who talked to their neighbors, and they're like, oh, this makes so much more sense, because, you know, Bob and Susan went out there and they helped change the mind of some of these conservation organization folks. And so this works for us. And so that's just that one little example of how that communication helps. Now, if that same change would have been made within government organizations' doors and they came out and rolled it out to the public, it wouldn't have been quite as successful, just because it doesn't have that credibility of being developed with the landowners themselves.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
Somewhat of a related question, I think, picking up where you left off, Shelly, and this is out for all the panel, I think, or maybe Nancy, you want to direct it at one particular panelist. Go ahead, Nancy.
Yeah, I think, so Nancy Lobby with the Nature Conservancy, and I've done lots of interaction with Shelly, so I probably know the answer to this question from her perspective, but I'd love to hear from the other two panelists. You know, trust, obviously, really, really important. I heard that from everybody, that it's this whole idea of trust building is very key, and it was one of the main themes. For those of us that are feeling this really, you know, sense of urgency, especially around climate change and how is it that we can affect more change, do you have some real practical sort of suggestions for diverse organizations? So those, you know, maybe outside of the landowner circle, how is it that we can build trust faster in order to affect change more broadly?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll try and start. My buddy Jim Stone is on, and Jim will tell you that I'm fast. I'm a fast mover. And during my time with PFC, Jim always spoke about the time that it took to build trust. And he's got something there, and I know it. But being a fast mover, that doesn't always work well for me. One of the things that I think is you've got trusted alliances, maybe third-party alliances. I have to say, for all of us, the Nature Conservancy is becoming a trusted partner, and yahoo! I mean, you guys are doing a great job But, there are some trusted partners that folks work with. As Shelly said, NRCS, Resource Conservation District. In my state, it's Cooperative Extension. So if you have sort of a program that you want to roll out, or you have something that you want to facilitate movement on, then my thought is go to that sort of third party trusted individual organization group. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Partners Program. I'm sorry, you guys, I should not have neglected you in that trusted partner place. But to me, that's a place where we can sort of ramp it up a little bit. I know that if my friend Paula Golightly comes to me and says, gee, Dina, I really want you to talk to this group or this organization, and hey, you know what, let's go to coffee together, and I will be there, and I got your back. I'm going to go because I trust Paula and I trust her judgment. And so again, I think it is about those relationships, but I think that, it is key to being able to sort of span those boundaries, is to bring in trusted folks to help us segue and help us, lead in, lean into those areas.
Well, a thought comes to my mind earlier this year, before the very strong COVID restrictions struck. I was so impressed with the head of the State of Arizona Historic Preservation Office. Catherine Leonard, who's the head of that organization, put together a summer event to have the Farm Bureau, the Arizona Cattlemen's Association, and the State Historic Preservation folks come together for a big meeting. And she asked me to come and talk about what we do on the ranch and what I've done with historic preservations and restore some old buildings here on the ranch and in the village. And I thought, wow, bringing these three groups together, this is really making progress. And I thought, gosh, I don't know if I'm the right person for this job. And I was very nervous about it, but she said I was it. Unfortunately, they had to cancel the whole event, but I liked her thinking. And when we talk about building trust, you've got to reach out beyond the choir that you sing to all the time. You really have to bring people together. If you want to really share some stories and really have a good talk before dinner, you need to introduce some people who have no idea of what you do, and then you get this wonderful exchange. You build relationships, and then the trust comes in. And what ends up happening, for example, these small towns in Arizona work with SHPO, and they've restored so many of these old buildings, and it's helped these rural communities. And so it's a win-win all the way around. But you got to be thinking outside the box and be bold enough to ask the question.
And my last little bit to add, I can't help but stop, but Nancy, you do the best job of really anybody that I've been around, and my recommendation would be to do what you do, and that's go to them, go to the landowners, go to their meetings, meet them on their turf. If you go to their board meetings, if you go to their cattlemen's meetings, if you start having conversations there, you start building trust. If you start showing up at multiple events that they're going to be at, all of a sudden, instead of being an outsider, you're started to be viewed as somebody that is truly interested and really, really wants to help. And so I honestly can't think of anybody else that's done a better job than you in your previous job when you were building up some support. And so, yeah, go to them, pull people aside, and then as you get a little bit farther down the road, you kind of schedule something either, maybe even right before or right after an event that's already scheduled.
Thank you, guys.
Great. I think we had a question from Susan. Susan, can you unmute yourself? I'm having trouble unmuting you from this end.
I can, thank you. You may have just answered it, but my thoughts are about you sometimes see agencies and organizations with good intentions kind of say developing a plan for a species. Landowners aren't involved, but they're like, okay, now we're going to go to the landowners. I mean, can you get them on the train? Has the train left the station? And maybe it's all those things you just talked about, answering Nancy's question, that you try to kind of backtrack on. Anything else?
I'm glad I've had time to read your question, because that is a tough one. And hopefully there's generally always some wiggle room in some ways to try to gather support. But what I would do is I would figure out how much you can move. Can you wiggle on these things? Like, your program and all the specifics about it, and go to ranchers and be like, or landowners and be like, hey, we made a mistake in doing all of this without your input, but I still think there's something salvageable here. Can you help us talk through this and make a plan to implement it, or to gather some support, or whatever it happens to be, so that we can get the train back on the track? And I would ask the questions, get the people involved. And instead of you making the phone calls to all the individual landowners you want, if you can find that a few of those key ranchers or landowners and ask them to bring 6 of their friends, and you do that 3 or 4 different times, and all of a sudden you've got a pretty good group there. But if they understand that they could have some influence over something, or that there's money available to do something that might help them, that's what might be bringing them to the table.
And I think you nailed it again, Shelly. And I think what you really want to do is, what's the low-hanging fruit, right? A little seed money can go a long way. And then I think the second part of that is, if you're in a place where you're having to backtrack a little bit, be so cautious about what you commit to. Because if you commit to something to a landowner and then you don't follow through, that just backs the whole process up. So be trustworthy, be cautious, be careful with your commitments, make commitments, look for the low-hanging fruit, and a little money goes a really long ways.
Well, I just might add my thought here, Susan. Hello, it's nice to see your face. I think Shelly made a very strong point, and I might add, select your messenger, for an introduction or something that has gone awry. Choose a landowner leader that is an influencer and that his colleagues and friends trust, because that can make a big positive difference in your effort. May the force be with you.
Oh, hey, I think Jim had a question too. Jim.
Oh, thanks, Steve. Ladies, I'm not sure any of us refs of Partnerscapes going to be able to do this. You guys set the bar too high, so thanks for that. But great conversation. So I think I've heard from most of you, but just thinking in a larger scale, where does the youth and high school and sort of use of college, either in volunteer or graduate programs, how do you all see that? I mean, I know we try to do that. It isn't as easy, and sometimes you get more to the college level, it gets pretty expensive at times. But what do you all see? Maybe some good tips for some of us that are struggling with some of that.
Oh boy, that's a really great conversation. If we can start influencing, young folks, we can change the culture. And there is a bit of a culture change that is needed and that we're kind of calling for here. And so speaking at youth camps, I serve as director for our Nebraska Youth Range Camp, and we talk about collaborative partnership right there. And Jim, I believe it was you that got us to thinking a little bit more about encouraging our professors to start talking about it in college classes, because I can tell you through my college career, I never heard anybody talk about collaborative conservation, and boy, they should have been. And so I've had that conversation with several of the professors here and friends that I have to try to get them to share that side of conservation, because unfortunately, we're not going to a place where people are getting more willing to work together as a society. We're kind of going the other way. We're trending the other way. And so in agriculture and in working lands, we need to dedicate ourselves to trying to change that narrative. And you bring up such a great point on saying that. And if all of us on this call could go to our professors that we work with and the researchers that we work with and share with them that we want that conversation to be held, I bet we'll make some change, and then take it a step further and offer to come in and guest lecture yourselves. I've offered to do that in Lincoln and haven't been called on it yet, but I suppose as classes get to be more and more in person, I am expecting a call.
And again, you're right. We have a university, Humboldt State University, that's in Arcata. Our friend Dean Hunt is geographically really close to it. He hosts college classes on his ranch and goes in to speak to them all the time. And it is that sort of talk about collaborative conservation. But I think there's another approach too. We've got a local land trust, and the land trust actually owns a small piece of property. I'm an advisor to that. They have school kids that come out. They have a program. I participate. I've helped them sort of develop what their agenda is. And it's really exciting to see, even from our rural towns, sort of these inner city kids come out and get their feet dirty. It's much like the program that Russell Davis was a part of many years ago. I think that just our ability to introduce kids from all levels to working landscapes and what they are has the power, hopefully, to influence them down the road. And so those are the two examples that I can think of. And I think organizations like Partnerscapes also play a role in helping youth come along.
Well, I agree with both of you, Dina and Shelly. It's a great question, Jim. I'll tell you my thoughts on it. You can even bring it down to an earlier experience. If you can work with extension folks and with LOAG teachers and introduce it at the high school level, and perhaps you can even bring these young people in to put a little sweat equity into it. These kids are always having fundraisers and whatnot. I mean, get creative thinking going here and get their hands in the dirt or behind the herd or whatever, but get them involved and get the NRCS. I mean, that sounds like a great opportunity for them to include young men and women, because really the earlier you begin, the better off you are. And they go into it with an open mind and a background on it. So.
Thank you so much for that, ladies. It just so happens that we've run out of questions, and we're just about run out of time. There's a lot of thank yous and jobs well done in the chat, but let's give a round of applause to our panelists, either on your screen or with your emoji. Either one is fine. We really appreciate all of you attending as well. There will be a recording of this made available. It'll be coming to you probably either later tonight or in the morning, that you'll be able to share with your friends, neighbors, or coworkers that you think might get some benefit from it. And if you want to get our Partnerscapes newsletter, where we've got we're trying to do one of these a month or so on different topics. Just go to our website and you can sign up there to make sure you know about what the next opportunity. So thank you all. Thanks for making the time, and thanks for the good nap time, Shelly. That worked out perfect. And send us off with a great visual. We appreciate it. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Bye, Conley.